call this meeting of the Historic Preservation Commission to order at 7:01. Terry or Marcus, can you take roll of the members that are present?
Mr. Hayes.
Here.
Ms. Holliday. Mr. Donald.
Here.
Mr. Roberts. Mr. Shepherd. Ms. Urban.
Here.
And Mr. Weiss.
Here.
Thank you. Okay, are there any changes to the agenda?
There are no changes.
All right, next is the approval of the minutes.
We don't have any minutes ready to be approved, so at the next meeting, we will do the past meeting and this meeting's.
Sounds good, thanks. Yeah, we were wondering, we didn't find them in the packet, so that sounds good. I have not received any written communications. Has anyone else received any written communications to share?
The office has not received any.
Does anyone in the audience want to address the Historic Preservation Commission tonight? No. There are not any continued public hearings as far as I'm aware.
Correct.
There is not any unfinished business, old business.
No old business.
There are not any new public hearings.
Correct.
There is not any new business that I'm aware of.
Correct.
The monitoring of the historic properties. At our last meeting in November, Marcus divided up the historic properties list, and that was shared with us via Google Drive. If you have not been able to go to that link, we can get that again from Marcus. But there are specific addresses that are assigned to each one of us to monitor. I know that I myself was able to do that this past month, but I haven't actually put it on the spreadsheet.
Okay.
As far as the properties I was supposed to look at, I didn't see any changes.
Okay.
Or anything happening there. And so I'd ask the same of anyone else. If you were able to look at those properties, and if you noticed any changes to the exterior, anything that's happening at those locations.
I will mention that Laura submitted and took pictures and put them into the spreadsheet, which is great because as we do that, we can kind of establish a timeline of, a photo documentation of our monitoring, which is awesome. If you do that, please also add in a comment that said either, for this first one might be baseline, appears to be no changes, and then in future ones, take a picture and put in no change, or looks like they changed a window, or looks like they added a garage, and then we can, follow up on it. What I'd also like to do eventually is put in photos from when the property had actually been landmarked so that you know what the actual baseline was when it was nominated. Because something might look like it's been there for 10 years when it actually might have been, but was maybe added without, approval 5 years after it was nominated. So, this is a process in progress. And I think also Trent had marked up his properties, and he hadn't found any noticeable changes either.
Okay, yeah, that would help. I did notice with one of the properties that I had on my list, the windows looked newer.
Okay.
But there's nothing active right now. I don't know if it happened 10 years ago, 15, if it was, sent through here or not.
Right.
But that would be good to know, I guess.
Right. And if you note something like that, then I can go in and look at building permit, issuances to see if they did indeed, or if perhaps they just look like they're in really good condition, but they're 20 years old.
I haven't submitted a report yet. There weren't any changes, but for the record, I have the 800 block of West Main Street, and I was really happy for the excuse to experience in person the bike path convergence where they were going to take out brick sidewalk in order to figure out how to have a safer situation for bikes getting to the corner. And so we worked with someone in the city to figure out a better approach to that. So it was actually, I hadn't experienced it live.
So it turned out
The
well?
result, I was pretty happy with
Great.
it. Yeah, so
For the
that was
record,
cool.
Terry, and then we can pass that on to Public Works, that they did a good job.
It's on the north side, right at the corner with South Lincoln.
Yeah, I know Craig Schonkweiler was the assistant city engineer at the time, and he
sounds
took
right.
great pains to try and get that convergence and the crossover of Lincoln Avenue to get it done well.
Yeah, it was great.
Nice, thank you. Okay, now we're moving into the staff report. Marcus, do you want to share that?
Sure. It's kind of short over the holidays. The first item is the CLG grant update. It turns out that we are only allowed to submit 2 grant applications, so we submitted 2 grant applications. One for the Royer Education Project. It's gone beyond just a brochure update. And also for the historic preservation website reconstruction. I've left a couple voice messages and emails for John Presley. Again, it was over the holidays, so I will continue to check in with him to see when we might learn, when we will hear what the grant awards are. I'm pretty confident and hopeful because I think they don't have a huge number of grants submitted. But John was really on the ball this year, and he advertised it well. I think this was his first grant cycle as the SHPO CLG representative. So he might get a slew of applications. But we'll keep our fingers crossed. And then trying to get the finance department lined up to handle our intern hirings, especially for the website. A lot of that is going to be handled by the intern. A lot of the Royer Education Project is going to be handled by our commission members, but there will also be some tasks for the intern to do, so we need to be able to start paying them as soon as possible. And then the only other item we had was in items of interest was Preservation Month activities. May will be here sooner than we know, so we can start getting ready to assist Kate in advertising or staffing the Mid-Century Modern Housing Tour, advertising it. I know David's been involved with also the exhibit there at the Cranard.
At the Cranard Art Museum, which opens later this month.
Oh,
Yeah. I mean, it
And-
runs all spring, but it's, going to be.
make sure we hit that in our announcements at the end of the meeting. And then as far as historic property activities, we haven't really had any new landmarking inquiries. Kate and her class have continued to work with Reverend Freeman over at First United Methodist Church on their National Register historic listing, which hopefully then we would do a quick turnkey into making that a local landmark. And then for the certificates of appropriateness, we worked with VoloNet, who was the utility company that was installing fiber optic there at Buena Vista Court. They turned in their proposed work, which was underground fiber optic installation with those flat at base ground access panels, to access fiber optic in the ground. The only above ground work was attaching the little interface boxes on the homes, which are pretty innocuous and everywhere, whether it's telephone or Cablevision or fiber optic, but they're also temporary. They're not a permanent alteration. So the zoning administrator determined that that would be an exempt activity because they were temporary and did not meet the definition of undertaking, and so that one's taken care of. Still have to work with the new owners of 8 Buena Vista Court on figuring out if they're going to finish the removal. I believe the access ramp has been removed, and they've been working on, the previous owner worked on the porch and the front porch alterations. I don't think anything happened in the last year, so we have to figure out with them what they're planning on doing. And then finally, the major and minor works at the Hotel Royer. So the most recent extension that was granted by Urbana City Council was essentially an open-dated extension, which simply reduces the amount of I will call it tax reimbursement to them the longer it takes them to open. So there isn't any, you have to be done by the end of June. It's the longer you take, the less the city's going to reimburse you, so there isn't a hard deadline. So I personally am not worried. I see progress on there every week. They have the new exterior sconces up. The parking lot has been striped. The street lights out in the parking lot have been replaced. They have submitted monument sign permit applications, and we've been working on them with figuring out how to do landscaping there, as much of the landscaping is along the perimeter, which is shared with the city. So we're working out possibly a memorandum of agreement on allowing the hotel to install and maintain landscaping along the perimeter. So those are things that the city doesn't do very often and are going to take some negotiation. But I'm pretty comfortable that things will come to a close well before the end of this year, which is not a date that anybody should quote anywhere, because I'm not in charge of anything, and that's just my personal and professional feeling on the progress there that I've seen. And that's really it on my staff report, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Marcus. Any questions? No questions from me either, or did you have something? Okay. I was trying to look in my notes to see, for some reason I had in my memory that we would hear back from John Presley in February, that was the notification period, but I can't seem to find it, so maybe I'm mistaken.
And so if you happen to find that, definitely please let me know, and I'll look again through the CLG manual to see if perhaps there's a timeline in there that I've forgotten about or missed. Because, yeah, if they said that they would notify people in February, I should not be pestering him in December and January.
Yeah, but hopefully we'll learn something by then. But, yeah, I can't seem to find it. I'll let you know. But all that sounds good, and noted with the hotel, the same every time I drive past it, which is at least once or twice a week. I still see progress, even though we're in the, winter.
Yes.
There's still stuff happening, so we're getting closer. Fingers crossed, very close. All right. If we don't have any other questions for you, Marcus, I think it's time to go into our study session, which this study session will be specific to the Historic Preservation Plan from 1998, which everyone should have a copy of. So just a couple of, I guess, items of note, and Marcus probably has some more that he wants to mention to us. The last few times we met was also around the time when the city was putting together, or finalizing the full plan for the city, called Imagine Urbana. And so everybody had a chance to look at that and provide comments. Since the Historic Preservation Plan, which is, of course, part of the city, is being updated after that plan, as you noted, it did not mention this one, likely because of the date and how outdated this plan is. As we move forward, we just want to keep that in mind, that anything that we update, or if we work with a firm to update, we want to make sure that the historic preservation plan update reflects the cities. And so when I was looking in that Imagine Urbana plan, there were a lot of areas that were really, I would say, that spoke towards this, but not necessarily with the exact same language. And we talked about that a little bit, like the adaptive reuse and there's different sections that there are at least 2 sections that really tied in well with what we talk about here with our commission. So I think that it's just something that we want to note and be aware of, especially when we start going down a timeline of would we want to put out a request for proposal for firms, or, whichever way we're going to go with updating this plan, whether it's in-house or with a firm. All right, Marcus?
So one of the things that I think any good plan revision does is takes an inventory of what your baseline is. They did it with the comprehensive plan, looked at its goals and implementation steps, and then checked off which ones were done, which ones were partially done, which ones weren't done at all, and why, perhaps. And then you have to decide if those are still your goals. Things might change over 25 years. So I usually take the same approach with any sort of planning. What do we have in place? So I looked at the 1998 plan, skimmed through it. It's not really a summary. It kind of looks like a table of contents. But there aren't, to me, when you get where the rubber meets the road is about halfway down the page in the summary where it says the 4 goals of the Historic Preservation Commission: conduct surveys, prioritize the surveys that it's going to conduct, identify and designate landmarks and districts, and apply for CLG grants and other preservation funds. And that's those are those implementation steps. There are the purposes of preservation, which, and I may as well, I'll pull it up here. On the screen. So, purposes of preservation: promote the preservation of our historic resources, promote economic development by encouraging investment in historic resources, preserve the character of historic neighborhoods, foster understanding and civic pride in Urbana's history and architecture, preserve Urbana's historic downtown buildings and facades. Those 5 big goals of preservation. And if those are the 5 purposes, are the 4 goals of the Historic Preservation Commission hitting all 5 of those? And now maybe those don't have to align one for one, or maybe they should. Maybe the HPC works with the Economic Development Division to work on the economic development of downtown, and also with them and the Building Safety Division to focus on preserving downtown's buildings and facades. Do we need to, work with the building code to figure out ways that people can adaptively reuse structures more easily and more acceptably by the building official, finding out where those pinch points are on, you know, why it's hard to adapt a historic building to a new use. Another section talks about the other plans that are involved, the comprehensive plan, the zoning ordinance, building code, ADA regulations, the Illinois Accessibility Code, but it doesn't go into detail. It just kind of like mentions them and doesn't say what the issues are and how to address them. I know that in building code there is a section that talks about historic structures and the allowances that there are so that they don't necessarily have to meet all of the code requirements for new construction. I think it would be very handy if those were in the preservation plan so that somebody looking at the city's premier preservation document would know how the city feels about preserving history while still providing safe structures. And then it also speaks to the building official to say, look, we understand you have a building code, but the city thinks it's important that you use the allowances that are given to you to make it not necessarily easy, but reasonable for somebody to adapt a building. Maybe there's an easier or well spelled out variance process. I know we have a property maintenance code board and a building appeals board where you can take a variance request from the building code to that board. I've never dealt with it before for a historic structure. It's kind of a black box for me. So digging into that to figure out, we don't have a ton of historic buildings, so I think it's really important that the ones that we have, we keep. And then the plan goes on to talk about different kinds of historic resource surveys. As I read it, it gave me the feeling that it kind of actually expected the HPC to take the lead in doing surveys. And maybe that's what was happening in 1998. And it kind of maybe evolved into, this would be a good discussion to have with Alice Novak. You know, I saw, I think, not Rob Kowalski, but the other, Robert Myers's names on some of the surveys. He was one of the planning staff members. Alice Novak's classes did surveys. We have had very few surveys done in the last 10, 15 years. We've had some performed by PACA, but we still have a lot of properties that we want surveyed. And if that is still a goal, which we need to identify, then we have to figure out how we're going to do it and prioritize them. And then there's a section about incentives for preservation, existing and possible alternative incentives. There is state property tax freeze, I believe, that's available, but we don't talk about it. We don't advertise it. That's something that commission and staff could figure out a good way to do that. There is the existing local historic district and historic landmark designations, but I also know that a while back Dennis Roberts had suggested a secondary, not a landmark, but like an honorable mention sort of designation with a plaque of an important structure, but not designating it a landmark, which also carries along the burden of having all of your activities on the exterior of it reviewed by the city. There are just some people that don't want that, or they don't want it to be a burden on future property owners. And if that got more properties protected, even by a symbolic designation as opposed to a regulatory designation, I think that's a good idea. There are lots of cities that do that. I've got photographs of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I was visiting a little home-based business with my sister, and I go up onto this row house, and there's a brass plaque on it, and I asked the property owner about it, and it's like, well, it's not a landmark, but it's a designated historically important property. And there are many cities that have this kind of tiered system. So, and again, that's not a financial incentive. It's simply an acknowledgement. And there are other ways to do incentives, and part of the process of, or one of the purposes of the plan is to explore those so that staff and commission aren't spinning their wheels about what to do. This plan is to get things on paper to try and provide guidance for people on how to do things. And then the next section goes on and talks about preservation and education, forums, so public educational opportunities, cooperation, that be collaborating with other organizations. And then their agenda for future action was simply 2 steps: adopt the ordinance and implement the plan. Not a lot of little micro steps in there for guidance, which if you look at even the 2005 comprehensive plan, there are, 10 bullet points for every single one. And then if you go into the appendix, there's a spreadsheet of who's the responsible party for each of these, and who has the responsibility and authority to do what. And I think it might even say when should it be accomplished by. I think some people call that micromanaging. I call that milestones and digestible bites for staff to do. And it helps it be easier to put into a division's work plan. We're going to do these 3 things, and it's going to cost this much, and it's going to take this much staff time. Not that it can't be reprioritized. Every year we could look at this, and I could go through and say, here's the 3 things we got done. Here's the other things we tried to do and where we hit roadblocks. Do we still want to work on that? And eventually, if we find that things need to be changed, we can do amendments to a plan. We don't have to wait 25 years to do a full revision. So then the other thought I had was, I can start collecting a library of other organizations' plans, put it in the Google Drive. I can start looking at plans. Others can start looking at plans. Can create a little rubric where people can be put in, oh, I liked Houston's. Here's 3 things that I think were great, and here's maybe 1 that Urbana could do. I thought Bowling Green, Ohio's was fabulous. Here's some ideas. And then after 3-4 months of that, we could have a good bullet point list of things that we'd like to look at that we could then turn over to a consultant and say, here's our background research, here's what we'd like to move towards, here's some ideas. Or if, the decision was to do it in-house, work with a class. The university's been putting out some good products for the city, but everybody can, if you don't give them any roadmap, they're going to go and figure something out on their own, and then it's your job to filter it and pull it back. Whereas if you can provide them some guidance, then that helps them get closer to where you want to be. Not that they can't tell you, well, we found these other really cool things which aren't on your list. Would you be interested in those? And you might love those. But this helps establish a baseline of, in the vacuum of not having anything else, what does our commission want to do? So that's my presentation. And I'm happy to answer questions, discuss, take suggestions, and act on your behalf.
Thanks, Marcus, and we'll have just an opportunity to all say something if we want, but I just wanted to add that I think a good objective for today is if we could come up with a rough timeline, because it is a good point of, you know, whether this goes the route of a firm or if we work with students, we still need to have this basic timeline, because if we are to pay in any kind of way, we would be wanting to submit a grant for the next CLG cycle, which means we need to have everything in order by like next October.
Yes, yes. And that could be, here's what we want our next plan to have in it. And that is, I see the purpose of reviewing the current plan, figuring out the commission's goals for preservation in the city, what it may or may not want to see. That's that, and giving SHPO enough of a feeling that we know what it is that we want to hire somebody to do. And the funding will be to pay them to do it. And part of that might be, you know, hiring a firm, but we will still have a steering committee. Who would the steering committee be on it, and what's their role? Would they meet every month with the consultant, whether that's a company or a class? I think it's getting enough information to convince SHPO to give us money to fund the plan itself.
Oh, you can, I reread the plan today, and it got me, I have to say, kind of fired up. So if there's ever a movie about the Urbana Historic Preservation Commission, I would like me to be played by Sally Field, channeling her Norma Ray. It really, so I actually have notes, and I'm going to try to follow an outline and putting some remarks on the table, which is that there's a lot in this document that is really good, and it was no doubt advanced with great intentions, just as I'm sure that's true from all other cities' Historic Preservation Commission documents. But I feel like we really need a radical revision, and here's why. Because history is not the past, right? So history is interpretation of the past. So we're always making history in the present. The past, we just agree, is a condition, but history is preservation of the past. And this document actually sets up, the plan in this document is not to preserve the past. It is, well, it is indirectly, but it really is to preserve history. You said that earlier, preserve history. But the history it's inviting us to preserve is the one that it gives at the beginning of the document, which basically says Native American people were here, but they were transient by their own choice, because it says, you know, you don't really find very many traces of them. In other words, it's prioritizing settlement as an excuse for claim, so it's a real estate priority, right? Buildings, real estate. And then they were gone, so pushed to the side, and they're replaced by men, rich white men. You would not know that there were any women involved in the genesis of this community. I found mention of like buildings on campus, like a women's residence hall, or a building that's named after a woman, but they're not described. And so then I got very suspicious when it's asking us to do things like promote the preservation of our historic resources. What it says is our historic resources are the tangible real estate amenities of rich white men in this community. And in a way, that's what we're doing. So I feel like we need a radical rewriting, because we don't want to preserve their history. We want to practice history, meaning interpretation of the past, according to our own priorities, values, things that are contemporary to us, which in my understanding of this community means the story of people, things, conditions. So that means redressing Native histories. It means acknowledging that women are part of this formula. It means acknowledging other people of color. It also means acknowledging what I would call the landscape elements here, the prairie, trees of Big Grove, traces of that, the Boneyard Creek, which in the mindset of the people who profit in this place, the men celebrated here, and in the continuing mindset of the community, have value insofar as they support economy, whether that is industry or at this point, you would say leisure, like recreation. But those, people aren't talking about preserving trees the way that they talk about preserving buildings. And I think in our value system today, they should be. So I would really like to invite us to look at the plan, but imagining that what we aim to preserve is more expansive. It's quite different. It's not about real estate. It's not about banking. It's not about a political conversation from 160 years ago, right? Acknowledging that. But that it's getting a better understanding of who is here, you know, what content is there. I mean, it really came across to me as like an echo of the colonial Williamsburg development from, you know, starting in the 1920s, where more than 50% of the people who lived in colonial Williamsburg were Black, and yet Black people weren't allowed to go there as tourists, except on the day it was closed. And they weren't represented anywhere except eventually as like elegant servants. But the condition of slavery on which the whole economy depended wasn't acknowledged at all. And it's only in the last 15 years that they've begun to actually address that. And in doing that, it's become a much more interesting place. It's not about rehearsing white privilege and as prestige. It's about honestly addressing stories. So I feel like some of the things it asks us to do, totally great as abstractions. And if you change what you mean by history, the charge is still pertinent. But in one sense, it's like if we were to rewrite the history, the historical summary at the beginning according to new priorities, we might be asking for to support different things than what we're asking for, right? It would help us, give us an excuse to frame the work, I would say probably more expansively and certainly more richly.
I think that's
my 2 cents.
Amazing, and a radical shift from just preserving buildings to culture. Mm-hmm. And maybe I would even lay out those goals before I stepped into the historical summary, because I think starting off with the history and then going to the goals kind of to me implies that this history that we just summarized for you is what drove our goals. Whereas if you lay out the goals at the beginning of the plan and then you talk about your version of the history, what your goals were kind of frames to the reader how you see that your history developed.
That's a great idea, because then it acknowledges the subjectivity of different, generations of people. And I mean, Nietzsche would say there are 3 kinds of history. There's a monumental history, which is what this is doing. It's taking a narrow sector and honoring that, and to the exclusion of everything else. And there's antiquarian history, where you don't know the value of anything, so everything is as important as anything else. If it's from the past, it's, has to be addressed in some way. But then there's critical history, which simply says that, like, we have the right to look at how people did things in the past, the histories they wrote, and to say, yeah, no, we don't agree with, that's not objective fact. That's their interpretation of something, and we have different values. And so we can praise them and we can criticize them. We have the right to do that. And so when what you're proposing, it's like there's a general framework, because this is a commission within a city. But then it's like the history could be a living document, that each year people look through it and say, do we need to change something about this? And they rewrite history, they reinterpret the past as they do the work, and then it guides them in what they could focus on.
I'll just say real quick, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I like how eloquently you described just your perspective for how you looked at it, and I agree. We need to be more expansive in how we redefine or update and redefine what this plan could be for us. And when I was looking at this plan, it very much was like a point in time. You know, it's from 1998, and it very much read like that. It read like a plan from 1998. And I'm sure at the time it was critical that this plan was published, because, I mean, I read it as it really was the beginning of having a Historic Preservation Commission for the city, you know, for example. And sadly, you know, I feel like we've gone way beyond this plan, but we haven't had a chance to update it. And so I think we are well overdue. And I agree with you, Marcus, that, you know, looking at like those objectives that are in this plan, that helps us get started. Like, it helps us, you know, at least know where we should start looking and what is of interest to us, whether we deviate completely, if we look at other examples, however we can go about this, it gives us a starting point. But, you know, I agree that I anticipate it will be vastly different from what we have here. And even in the sense of how plans have changed, you know, as you mentioned, Marcus, about there's not really anything actionable in here beyond like creating a preservation commission and creating an ordinance. So like, you know, plans have changed drastically since the 90s. So yeah, I appreciate your comments. I appreciate that we are able to have this discussion. I want to pass it on if either of you have anything you want to say.
Well, I believe the framework that Professor Hayes described is invaluable. It's grounding, and then there's also the practical, like how does this windowsill in this building fit with the style that it was made? You know, that may be very superficial, but I think a good I think balancing it in an acknowledgement is very refreshing.
So, and I'm going to jump ahead for a moment here. So, going back to, like, you know, if we had one objective today, looking at a timeline, so we'd want to know what's our end timeline, and really, I think, you know, like, so I think the CLG was due beginning November, if I'm not mistaken, or sometime around then. So we want to have at least a semblance of what we're going to do. I would say like by September, really. Because that's when you get in the mode of starting to write the grant and getting everything prepared for that early November submission. And so thinking about that, it's January now, which is perfect time to be having this conversation. That gives us 9 months. We'd want to, of course, have a period of time to send out RFPs to get a general idea of an estimate for how much it would cost if we were to go the firm route. We could also, during that time, kind of figure out what it would cost if we went with, you know, a semester with students or some type of capstone. I'm not even sure what that would look like exactly, but we could get it. We could do that work as well on the side. But before we get to that point, so say we'd want at least, maybe you know, Marcus, what a better time estimate for that be. I would say at least, what, 3 months, 4 months for the RFP to go out?
So I guess my question would be, and I don't know how the RFPs work with the city. I know there are like state purchasing requirements. it feels like it's gonna be kind of a weird question to say, okay, we're gonna apply for a grant in November that might get funded by February. Then are we allowed to like put out an RFP before the grant is awarded? Because if the grant isn't awarded, then people are expecting, would people be expecting to get an award? Or can you put out an RFP for something that's completely speculative? So that's something I'll ask our finance folks. I mean, and then I think some of the other research that we can do in lieu of an RFP is start looking at the National Association of Preservation Councils. They have an email list, and they talk about, you submit questions, and it's like, how much did your preservation plan cost when you send it out, and what did you get out of it? People will respond and say, well, it took X amount in dollars, it took X amount in months, here's what our RFP looked like. And then there are consultants here in Illinois that I think would give us an idea of what something cost simply from a question to them. If you were going to do a preservation plan, how much would it cost? Not giving them an RFP and wanting them to write a bunch of stuff, just a ballpark. And that, I think, those preliminary researches would tell us in our CLG grant application about how much we might need. And if the consultant that we eventually hire does it for less, great. But we will have told them up front, we've got 15, 20 grand, whatever it is that the grant gives us. So that's not really an answer to your question about RFPs and timelines, but I think those are kind of the action steps that we need to start working on, and that I can work on as well as a staff member, while the commission is doing the hard part about having the discussions about what are the goals, how do we want to approach preservation or conservation or cultural acknowledgement, whatever it is that we want to call it, that we have in the past called historic preservation. Will probably still always be the Historic Preservation Commission unless we change the name of the commission. But more interesting things have happened than that. Gender studies.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point about the, I wasn't thinking about the request for proposal being,
Yeah.
but that makes sense, that it might be a little tricky. So, yeah,
But-
we want to find out.
Yes, yeah, so I've got a star next to that.
Yep, but yes, we need to have a better, at least idea before even getting to that submission point.
Right.
Because we don't want to, you mentioned if it comes under, that's great, but it could also go over, and then we're
Right.
in trouble.
Right.
So,
And so that's, I think, where, keeping a firm rein on whoever it is that's doing the plan for you, we need to police your expenditures and make sure things don't get out of hand, and that we at least get the deliverable that we need.
So I have a question about just the scope of work we would undertake, because the commission didn't write this document. It was produced by the Plan Commission and approved by the City Council. When this was written, the Historic Preservation Commission didn't exist yet.
Correct.
So is it under our agency to rewrite our own plan? Does that make sense? Just to confirm that? I assume so.
I am more than happy to
But I
check
actually
into that.
don't know how that works.
Right.
Does it have to come from, certainly the city has to approve it, but.
Yes.
So I
City
guess,
Council would adopt it.
so it seems like before we can know who would do what kind of work, that it would be valuable to simply like have a working session where we have looked through the document and we simply go page by page and say like, yeah, that's, we can keep that. This is about like updating. There are lots of great resources at the end. There's bibliography that hasn't been updated in 25 years, right? So, I mean, but that's great that there's bibliography. That's great that individuals and agencies are listed in here. So, like in one sense, the work would be update this section. And another would be edit this section or revise this section. So in a sense, I think it would be helpful to know how much work do we need to do and where is that? What's the nature of that work? And then on that basis, we'll know, yeah, we could do that. Or, well, Kate's amazing, program that she's building now, they could do that. Or a student is coming here to work with Kate who would want to take that on. I mean, we would know kind of what jobs need to be done, and then to what degree we might do one part of it ourselves and someone is hired to do something else. I don't know. But I feel like as I said at the beginning, there's a lot in here that's actually really good.
Okay.
And so if we could look through it together and make decisions about what seems okay to stay, what needs to be changed, and then we'd have a task list in a way. We'd be then well prepared to apply for a grant or put out a request for proposals or talk with Kate or something.
I think, hear a question that was, does the HPC have the authority to revise the plan? Is that oversimplifying what I heard as a question?
I know, I was curious about it before,
Yeah,
just
no,
knowing that.
It's a great question that I just assumed that we did, and we meaning staff too, you all. But I will start asking that question in a more firm manner and say, before I waste a bunch of people's time, I want to know what the steps are to update this and how that would roll. And, does it go? So the historic preservation ordinance is part of the zoning ordinance.
Yeah. And
So any changes to the historic preservation ordinance have to be approved by Plan Commission and then City Council. The preservation plan is a city-adopted document. I don't necessarily think that there should be a reason that Plan Commission has to say anything about it. I think it would simply be reviewed and approved by City Council.
the reason why I feel unsure about that is because
Yes.
the document itself, the framing sheet for it that's signed, it calls it an amendment. It's ordinance number 9798-111, an amendment to the comprehensive plan of the city of Urbana.
Right.
And so it's an amendment to a document that's not under our control.
Right. So after and I don't know how it was originally processed. After the plan was adopted by City Council, they then adopted it as an element to the comprehensive plan. So when they do the bicycle master plan, it gets reviewed by Plan Commission and then goes to City Council to be adopted.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the city can adopt plans and have them not be part of the comprehensive plan,
Okay.
like
that's
maybe the capital improvement plan.
Right.
Or I think maybe the Boneyard Creek master plan might be a master plan that's not an element of the comprehensive plan. So in the case where we have a adopted plan, because there was maybe a 1985 comprehensive plan already. So was this adopted as an element to does it say what date of the comprehensive plan on there?
It doesn't give the date of of the plan of which this, I mean, this is amending.
Okay. So
Yeah, no, it doesn't, no.
as you add these elements to the comprehensive plan, whether it's a bike plan or a historic preservation plan or the Champaign County Greenways and Trails plan, they call it amending the comprehensive plan because you're adding another chapter to it, or another, actually, more like an appendix to it. So, yes, if we adopt this preservation plan, I would expect it to then get adopted as an element to the 2025 comprehensive plan. So I should clarify with the structure of, hey, if we're going to do this, who gets to put their hands on it? For example, the land development code is a separate chapter of the city code. And when we revised it after 20 years, Plan Commission got to look at it and make suggestions, but they don't make a recommendation on it because that's not part of their powers and responsibilities. I don't think Plan Commission, I'll double check, but I don't think they have a say-so on the preservation plan itself, as opposed to the ordinance. Now, presumably, once we revise the preservation plan, if there are things that are missing in the ordinance, we would want to update that to align with it, which is what they did back in '98. They wrote the preservation plan, and then they wrote a preservation ordinance, which Plan Commission then reviewed and amended the zoning ordinance to add it in. I will check on that.
Okay.
And it's a really good question, because as far as I know, we haven't had any revisions to the preservation plan. So there's not really, do you know of any, Terry? Okay. So there really isn't a structure that I know of to go back and look at, here's how we did it in the past.
So that's a really good first question, because that really drives
Yeah,
how we move forward.
yeah.
But still, I want to try to think about what this would look like, because, okay, so assuming that we get a yay on that versus a nay, while you were talking, I was kind of thinking about the different phases that we would need to look at, but I'd welcome any comments or additions. So first, internal, doing a deep dive into the document. I know that Marcus and I have talked about what that looks like. I like your idea of, like, you know, we come here ready and prepared with our notes in the pages of what we want to add. We talked about whether that would be like asynchronous, like setting it up as a Word document, we add comments. The challenge of that, of course, is we can't have this dialogue behind the scenes. It needs to be public. So we were trying to figure out how that would look or how it would work so that everyone would have a chance to add comments. I think that is a good idea about, you know, you can do that on your own. You provide the comments, you come here with the comments, and then we have a study session providing those comments. So that could be a workable solution to get us forward. So that would be the internal review process, which could also include the preservation ordinance, as you brought up. And then another phase would be that external plan review, which when I mention external, I think there's two parts to that. So the one part is external, as you mentioned, like other examples from other cities that maybe speak to us in different ways that we want to bring forward. But there's also external in the sense of external to the historic preservation plan, but also within Urbana. So what plans do we want to tie this to? And so there's two components to that external that we need to make sure we include in our timeline. And then another phase, and I'm not sure which comes first here. I have two others that I thought would be important. So one would be figuring out those estimates. So if that's, you know, talking with different consultants, whether it's talking with the National Historic Preservation Association, so that we could get a better sense of what others have received for different plan updates and different levels of that, or whether that's RFP. But then the other side of that is, what do we want in our plan? And so I'm not sure that we could get an adequate estimate without knowing what we want in the plan. But then again, it could go both ways, right? Like, we could ask for everything, and then we'd have to shed some items off if we're asking for too much and it costs too much money. So I guess in my head, there's like 4 different parts to our timeline. But is there anything that I'm missing or that you think would be important to include? Internal plan review, external plan review, estimates, and then what do we want?
I feel like what we want should come before estimates, because then it's like, what do we want? And then the estimates is like, how much is that gonna cost? Andrew, were you gonna say something a moment ago? I know you well enough to know that I know you from seminars. Usually you've got something very interesting to say when you open your mouth that way. Pressure's on.
No.
Angela, could you restate your 4 things just for the
Yes,
purposes of the minutes?
definitely. Do you want to say something first?
No, please go ahead. I was just laughing with Andrew, but I want to say something after you've said something, because you raised a really, really amazingly important point in what you were saying, and I think we should underscore it in a second. But.
Okay, and I'm just, this is just what's coming out of my head. We can add to it. We might look at it later and want to add more. It's fine. So initially, we would want to do that internal, in-depth review of the plan, page by page, put all of our information together. That would also include reviewing that preservation ordinance. Then we would look externally. There's 2 parts to the external review. It would be looking at other relevant City of Urbana plans that we would want to make sure we complement or speak towards. But then also reviewing other cities' historic preservation plans. And those can come from anywhere. What speaks to us? What components do we like from those other cities? And then another phase would be, what do we want in our plan?
Okay.
After we looked at what we have, looked at what others have, what do we actually want in this updated plan? And then also there's the estimates for those updates, the update to the plan.
Okay, so 5 things, and it's kind of an inductive thing. An internal review of our existing plan and ordinance, 2, other plans in Urbana that we would want to tie it to. So historic preservation, currently, what else do we tie it to in Urbana? Others plans, others historic preservation plans, so widening the scope just for comparison and gleaning. And then all of that leads us to a decision about number 4, what do we want in our plan? And then 5 is, what's it going to cost us? Or figuring out what's going to cost us that. Okay.
And along the way, the point that I thought was really, really like incredibly powerful was by thinking about how this connects to other commissions, other aspects of the plan commission's work. In a sense, what we're inviting is the possibility of what we do being integral to the big picture, so that it doesn't come across as it has in the past as a kind of decorative supplement, like an optional, oh, that's nice that they do that. But like, we don't get asked to do a lot of things that we probably should get asked. We don't get asked to weigh in on things when we should. But if others were, if we were accountable to others and others were accountable to us through a set of priorities that we can articulate in our history, the way that we interpret the past, then the work of the Historic Preservation Commission, or whatever it would be called, would have more teeth to it. So it wouldn't be, I fret sometimes with how this work is a kind of thing you do on a weekend, or if you have an interest in it, as opposed to absolutely being central to the process of managing the city, broadly speaking.
In response to that, which I think is fabulous and made me think of, there are other places in the zoning ordinance where Historic Preservation Commission is mentioned. For example, if there is a variance request or next to, adjacent to a designated landmark or district, the commission is supposed to be asked for comments prior to it coming to public hearing. Mm-hmm. And those are things that need to be top of mind for me, but also for you as well, and for the rest of city staff. Sometimes, you're processing a building permit and you don't have like a historic preservation map right there to say, where is this in relation to that? So we might need to develop a mechanism, whether it's GIS or something. But there are other places in the zoning ordinance, because they are tied together, where HPC is supposed to be asked for their input in things. The comprehensive plan. Where I could then see historic preservation plan revision evolving into is HPC coming to Plan Commission and saying, we're revising our historic preservation plan because this is how we see that historic preservation figures into city management and operations. This is already built infrastructure. So if it comes to things like adaptive reuse, that's regulated by the zoning ordinance and building code. If it comes to things like accessory dwelling units for very large old homes that might be allowed to be used for different configurations of the same number of people. If it was a 10-bedroom house, does it need to be a single-family 10-bedroom house, or could it be a 2-dwelling unit 5-bedroom house? Same number of people. So depending on how the Historic Preservation Commission feels that their purview, historic preservation, can impact and affect the other zoning and planning aspects of the city, I would encourage you to share that with those other boards and commissions.
Well, and that invites us to actually look at those other documents and to say, well, we need to be in this process earlier or differently. I'm on a committee on the University of Illinois campus called the Chancellor's Design Advisory Committee, and when I was invited to start, it was immediate on that earlier this year, last year, sorry. It was immediately obvious that there was a problem, which was that the committee, the first thing we looked at was for something where the signing off of the chancellor's approval was scheduled for 10 days later. And so, and we didn't meet with the chancellor. So it seemed extremely strange. And so the people had complained for a long time. Nobody really pays attention to anything we say. It's just we comment, but it doesn't go anywhere. And so to try to give the organization teeth, we're now the first group that looks at anything. And we come back in again, and it's completely changed what we can contribute. Where rather than them going way down and then someone saying, there's a big problem with this, and then everyone's like, oh, nuts. We can be helpful from the beginning.
Right.
So, and then I think also doing that work would help everybody see history in a more expansive way. I mean, when it says in there, when it says in here that a lot got destroyed and so there isn't much left to work with, that's according to the priorities that they laid out. But if you think of it more expansively, I mean, every single inch of this community is already in or somehow pertinent when you think about heritage, tangible and intangible heritage. The way they paved the road right out there is interesting, and it's worth thinking about. Who did that? How did that come about? Why did it happen when it happened? What's underneath it? What's coming, like that. So I think it would help people see the richness of this place as more pertinent to what they are asked to do in their daily work.
I've got some answers to get you.
So I guess on that, that would be first priority. I imagine that you could probably get that answer by the next meeting.
Definitely by the next meeting. I'm hoping in the next couple of weeks at the very latest.
Okay, excellent.
Thank
So if all goes well and we are allowed to move forward, just kind of looking at these objectives, I don't know exactly what we need, but I imagine if we were to give a couple of months to each, that really gets us close to September. I imagine that some areas will take longer than others. But, you know, for example, if we were to meet next month and start going through the plan page by page, I don't know if we have enough time, just with everybody works as well and you have busy lives. So maybe that's too short of a deadline, so maybe we would say February, March, you know, so just breaking it up like that. You know, so maybe we would, you know, only get through half of it in February. I don't know, but basically we would look at maybe 2-month blocks for each of these phases. That would get it, that really gets us to September.
I will say that the Open Meetings Act simply says that no more than 2 commission members can be present and doing something together. So if you all wanted to work in pairs, just discussing, hey, I like this part, or I think this part is not relevant anymore, or whatever, and coming up with notes that you want to submit back to me, and then you rotate pairs like a contra dance and be like, that's stuff you can do on your own between meetings. And it could even be not even in-person meetings, but just emailing back and forth. You just can't have more than 2 people in a conversation. And you can always include me, and I'm happy to respond back or just kind of be there as somebody collecting the conversation. And that might be a way to keep the momentum going. But, you know, today we met because we had to get started on this, and there was a little bit of a update about CLG, but it's hard to justify having a meeting without cases. So in case we don't meet for another month, this could be a way to keep, you know, the dialogue going, you know, and still meet our OMA requirements.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I know we won't necessarily meet at all these meetings. Sometimes
Right.
we're not able to. We don't have a quorum, what have you. But I guess still having those milestones between now and September is important, because I do see a lot of this work as asynchronous, you know, if we're looking at, well, I mean, some of it, though, we need to kind of figure out, right? Like, and we can't do all that tonight, but like, we need to figure out which plans which plans are relevant within the city that we want to review further.
Yes.
We don't all need to be doing the same things. So if we task it out, just like we did with the monitoring of properties, that might help us make some headway in these months to come. With the plan, the same thing. I mean, with this 1998 plan, I mean, it could be the same thing. You know, it could be people take sections.
Right.
I don't know. I know for myself, I needed to look through the whole thing in order just to even understand what I was. Yeah, so maybe we don't want to break this up, but we know when we're looking at outside plans, we're all going to have our different ideas or our different favorite cities that we want to include or look at, you know. So I guess just kind of making a draft timeline, if we just kind of go with and I don't, it's not very formal, where I just made this up right now, we might have other opinions, but like, if we're just looking at, you know, okay, the next couple months, we're focusing internally. Following focus months, we're focusing externally, 2 parts. You know, and that kind of moves us ahead. We know by August timeframe, we really need to start looking into costs.
So I have here February, March internal review, April, May external. Is that what you were, or maybe expanding those to 3 months each?
Yeah, I mean, it might be, but yeah, something like that. What do we want? I kind of just put down like June, July, but I mean, again, like that might need to change, especially if we aren't able to make a quorum, just because it's a big time of year when people take vacations and stuff. But I would say the estimates, which would be like our last part, we really need to start by the end of the summer, so August, September timeframe.
I think that's a really great timeline. Thank you.
With the overarching aim that there's a CLG application.
Correct,
Right,
yes.
that is the precise aim.
Yes, all of these, like, milestones are malleable, except we know we want to have something that we can write towards around September so we can be prepared for that CLG grant, which, as far as we are aware, we don't have a set deadline right now, but we know from this past year that it's like early November, we need to have everything submitted.
I will go ahead and make the 98 plan as a Word document and put it in the Google Drive. If people want to start adding comments, their own comments to it, don't respond to other people's comments. I'll also put in a blank version of the CLG grant application just as a placeholder, so people can be thinking about, oh, this is what they asked us for in the application, as we are working on our preservation plan write-up. Think about the things that they asked us, and let's try and be finding answers to those questions. And then as we get information to fill those sections, like what do we want out of the plan, necessary background information for the application, then I can start dropping draft chunks of text into the application, so when it comes to September, we've got it halfway filled out, rather than scrambling at the last minute to process 6 gigabytes of information down into a 3-page application.
Thanks, that's a great idea. If you don't mind too, would you reshare that link to everyone
Yes.
on the commission, make sure everybody can access it? Any other thoughts, comments before we close our study session?
Well, I would support the overall effort and say that there's commission members who are not here. I can't speak for them. I can't speak for everyone, but I do think we're the perception that the Historic Preservation Commission is some sort of gatekeeper of what's right and what's wrong. I think that's not true, and I think that revising the preservation plan in a sensitive way will help to define or undefine that perception.
And I think Andrew brings up a good point, is, outside of the commission meetings, this planning process, I hope, becomes a community discussion and a collaborative discussion. There are experts at the Urbana Free Library, at the university, in the school district. You know, if steering committees are put together, or, you know, town hall meetings are held, or informal salons in people's backyards, what do you see as preservation in Urbana? There are other organizations that want to assist as well. So it doesn't have to be just the Preservation Commission. So, and I would welcome you to think about those relationships.
Yes, Marcus.
Private, on your Google Drive, there's no conversation.
Not at this point, because we haven't started the planning process other than discussing how we would revise it.
Can we?
You have the ability to review the preservation plan and to send comments to the city at any point in time.
You will, with this.
Uh,
There's no cases.
You can still have discussion with city staff and with the commission. They've got their email addresses that you can contact them with. And you could even ask them for a meeting, as long as, you know, if it's a public meeting and we properly advertise it, we can set it up. Yeah. But that is a decision that the HPC makes, and I facilitate those happenings.
All right. So without further ado, I think we can close the study session. Does anyone have any announcements? You have an announcement, please.
Apparently I have an announcement. So just announcing that the exhibition Making Place for the Arts at Home, Performance and Mid-Century Architecture will open at the Cranard Art Museum later this month. The members opening is January 29th, 5:15, and the general opening is Thursday, January 30th from 5 to 7. The exhibition focuses on 4 houses designed by 3 architects, 2 by Jack Baker, Erlanger House in Urbana, and Baker's loft apartment on Chester Street in Champaign, Dick Williams' home on West University Avenue in Champaign, and John Replinger's second house for himself, his wife, and him in Yankee Ridge. It could have been a celebration of privileged white people hiring privileged white male architects to make houses for themselves. It is not that, however, because what interested us in these houses is the fact that they were designed to accommodate the arts as places where performances might take place or where new work would be generated. And so in that sense, it's very interesting to see them for what they were, which is from many people like alternative, or we could say queer spaces. A lot of really interesting things were happening there that weren't happening in other fora. So another question, the way that the exhibition is going to be quite different is that it's really asking visitors to help answer the question, what's the value of these places now? What do we make use of how do we make use of our understanding of them? How do we interpret them for our own purposes? So there are lots of really wonderful drawings and models in the exhibition. There are lots of corollary events and opportunities for conversation. It is an opportunity to engage. People will be invited to add content to the exhibition, to add comments, but also drawings, but also maybe you have a photograph, or maybe you were there, you had a story, to add those experiences. There's invitations to generate new work based on the exhibition, and that will be part of the programming. And there are lots of corollary activities like touring houses in our region. My section, the section I was given, was to help describe the context in which these architects and clients would have thought to do something like this. Why were they inclined to think that this was something they might do? Because it's quite unusual, like Jack Baker as apartment, to design a performance space in your apartment. Margaret Erlanger's house, she was the head of dance, and so she has it's a studio home. And Dick Williams thought of the main part of his house as a kabuki stage. He was interested in Japan, and a lot of great stuff happened there. And the Replingers, whose first house was a very heteronormative house focused on raising children, after the children were gone, they built a house that, and one wing is his studio, and the other is the weaving studio of Dot Replinger. So amazing materials and conversations happening there. But so to give context to that, I did a deep dive in the archives and framed 4 sections. One is about the Festival of Contemporary Arts, where the community, the university, got super saturated with visual, performing, and literary arts each spring or every other spring starting in 1948. So people got accustomed to going to the architecture building to see a painting exhibition, going to the hotel in Urbana to see faculty artworks, going to Smith Music Hall to see architecture and landscape architectural drawings, because they had to figure out where everything would fit. So encountering works of art in unexpected places became part of the culture. And then it looks quickly at 3 other situations. The experimental music studio in Stuyven House, which had been a sorority house acquired by the university that became an annex building for the School of Music. So Harry Parch was given a room in the attic to produce The Bewitched, one of the most avant-garde works of the 20th century, that then became the experimental music studio where a lot of electronic music, computer music was pioneered. And Japan House, the first Japan House, at West California and South Lincoln, where the Alice Campbell Alumni Center is now. But so transforming a late 19th century house, Victorian style house, into an immersive environment. And then the New Verbal Workshop, the last part focuses on the use by Herbert and Norma Marder of their house as the base for an experimental speech music ensemble, where they would sit on the floor with 4 others. Over the course of 12 years and an evolving personnel, they produced this incredibly interesting body of speech music coming out of their house and into the world through broadcast and live performances. So anyhow, it's coming up and it's going to run through July. So it'll be up there for a long time. And so Kate is also curating this, and hence, these connections to things like the mid-century modern building tours and all.
When you have a flyer, please forward it. And
Sure.
We'll make sure, Bridget Broyhan probably is well aware of what's happening, but I'll poke her, get
Great.
it in the newsletter.
Great.
Thanks, yeah,
Yeah.
looking forward to that exhibit. Not as cool of an announcement, but I wanted to mention, I was at Urbana Free Library the other day, and I saw a little brochure, and I neglected to I had copies for all of you, so I'll bring them next time. But the Champaign County Historical Archives had a little brochure right when I walked into the library at the entrance that were sitting out advertising a walking tour of Urbana. And of course, I was very curious. I wondered how this related to us. It's a virtual walking tour, so you don't have to, it's not a certain date or time or anything, but they have a website, and it includes the first stop is the Urbana Free Library, but then it's the Hotel Royer. There's actually several buildings that's on this walking tour that's, that, are part of our interest, So the Flatiron Building, for example, is on there. Courier Cafe is on there. Cohen Building, Princess Theater. the courthouse, so there's several. So anyway, I'll bring those brochures next time, but it's just a good reminder because the archives put this little walking tour together, but it's a good reminder that there's other people doing
Right.
very similar work.
And we
Is it all-
should link and share other people's resources as well.
Very
It's
much.
free advertisement for them and another resource to get people interested in the common touch point, which is history or whatever, interest in stuff historic.
I was just gonna say, that sounds like our walking tour, right? It's
It
like, wait,
very
is that a
much-
plagiarized walking tour? I mean,
They
what?
say it's theirs. I
Right,
believe
okay,
them. I'm
okay.
just happy that it's happening.
I know there's a repertoire, so.
Okay, so that's the end of our announcements. We will now adjourn the public meeting at 8:31. No business will be discussed after this meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much for coming.